Hello, and welcome to Responding to Critical Incidents, a training for new staff, interns, and volunteers at Nationality Service Center. I'm Gretchen Schanfeld, and I'll be guiding you through the presentation today. NSC has created a number of critical incident protocols to respond to urgent issues or emergencies that may arise during the course of our work. These protocols are intended to guide you and your fellow staff, interns, and volunteers in responding appropriately to these incidents. The protocols we'll be reviewing today include evacuation, public health emergencies and shelter in place, medical emergencies, mental health emergencies, child abuse, domestic violence, and our field safety guide. All of these documents are available on SharePoint under Agency Documents, Critical Incident Protocols. And at the end, we'll talk about how to submit an incident report. Let's start with evacuation, public health emergencies, and shelter in place. During an evacuation, you'll hear the fire alarm sound, or if you're the first on scene, you can pull the fire alarm located at various corners throughout the building. When we hear a fire alarm here at NSC, we evacuate, regardless of if we know it's a drill or something of that nature. We always evacuate if we hear the alarm. We do so without using the elevators, using the stairs near the front lobby near the elevators. Additionally, there are staircases located at the other three corners of the building, which are available in cases of emergency. Please note that these staircases should not be used in the event of a drill. I'd also like to remind you to facilitate the evacuation of clients as needed. For example, if you're facilitating a class or a workshop with a group of clients, remind them to quietly and calmly gather their things and evacuate using the nearest exit. We then gather on the north side of Arch Street near 13th Street. As you can see, where we cross the street over Arch and gather on the far side of the street. We also ask that you check in with your immediate supervisor and not leave the scene until everyone is accounted for. We then hear an all clear from the fire department or the emergency coordinator. As you can see on the protocol written that you have, our emergency coordinator here at NSC is our Director of Business Operations. Next, we'll touch on public health emergencies. So these may be initiating the public health emergency protocol may be necessary if an infectious agent is present or suspected. If we notice something like this, we want to isolate the threat and stay where we are, contact the front desk to issue a public health code public health over the intercom, and contact the appropriate authority, enter 911 in consultation with our emergency coordinator, our Director of Business Operations. When the issue is resolved or we're confident that there's no longer a threat, we can ask the front desk staff to issue a code public health clear over the intercom so that people know they're no longer need to stay in place. Finally, we'll touch on shelter in place, which similarly, you should isolate the threat, alert others to shelter in place, and ask the front desk to issue a code over the intercom and contact the appropriate authorities. And then finally, issue that code shelter in place lift. Next, we'll talk a little bit about medical emergencies. You'll notice I have here on the screen a badge. You'll notice on staff nameplates around the building, staff have different badges based on what critical incident responses they've been trained in. A number of staff here at NSC are CPR, first aid, AED, and Narcan trained, and so these are the staff that you will want to engage during a medical emergency. During these types of situations, our first step is to assess the need and determine whether it's a minor emergency where urgent professional attention is not needed, or whether there's a more immediate need where medical attention is required, or in the worst case scenario, the client is actually unconscious. Let's work first with the shorter protocol. If you assess that the client has a minor emergency, you can connect with first aid trained staff or use one of the first aid kits that's located around the building. There's one at the front desk, and several others located around the office. You then may want to consider contacting the health access team to refer the client to primary care if needed and they're not sure how to connect with their primary care physician, and then you should notify your supervisor. Next, let's talk about more immediate need where medical attention is needed. We would ask that you engage a colleague or call yourself to 911 and then engage some additional support. It's important to call 911 first, as the response time can be between 5 and 10 minutes, and we want to ensure we're getting immediate attention for the immediate need. You should then get support from several other staff members, including engaging a CPR, first aid, AED, Narcan trained staff member. You can identify these individuals through the name badges on their door. We also recommend that you engage a colleague or other staff member for what we call crowd control. And this is a staff member to clear the lobby, notify classrooms and teachers if needed, so that the client who's experiencing the medical emergency can have a level of privacy both during the medical emergency and as the paramedics arrive. Another key role that we found very helpful during these types of situations is our ambulance greeter. So this is a staff member to meet paramedics in the lower lobby who can provide information on the nature of the emergency and can also provide key client demographics if they're available, including the language the client speaks. Finally, you should make a decision about whether escorting the client in the ambulance to the hospital is appropriate. This will depend on the nature of the client's relationship with NSC, whether they have any other family with them. In any case, we should always conduct follow-up by contacting the client's family member or other emergency contact to meet them at the emergency room if possible. After the situation, and you'll notice that a lot of these are included in all of the protocols, we advise you to connect with your supervisor and other involved staff members to debrief, to talk about how things went, what could go better next time, so that we can learn and improve from each of these critical incident situations. And finally, we ask the first on scene to initiate completion of a critical incident report form, which we'll review at the end. This form should be submitted to your director and to the director of business operations. Next, we'll talk about mental health emergencies. Mental health emergencies refers to an individual who's having severe mental health challenges, such as thoughts or actions towards suicide, or other types of mental health crisis. At NSC, we use a nationally recognized model called Question, Persuade, Refer. It's an approach to engaging possible thoughts of suicide or self-harm. It's not intended to be a form of counseling, but instead is a means to offer hope and positive action. You can recognize staff members who've been trained in this model through this name badge, the QPR for Suicide Prevention name badge. So let's talk a little bit about the steps, the 3 QPR steps. First, we have the Q for question. We question the person directly about suicide. QPR teaches us not to be afraid to ask the question, as asking does not increase the risk. We can ask questions like, are you having thoughts of hurting yourself? I would like to ask you a few questions that will give me a better idea of what steps we need to take to help you keep safe. By asking directly, we can provide important support and get important information. In our asking, we use an assessment called ASLAP. This is a way of reminding ourselves key points of information we need to know in order to assess the level of risk. The A stands for already taken action. Has the individual already taken some action to harm themselves? And this might indicate that we actually have more of a medical emergency on our hands and need to initiate the medical emergency protocol, including and up to calling 911. We can also assess the specificity of the plan. How specific is the person's thoughts? Do they have a very specific thought-through plan that they're planning on implementing? Thirdly, we look at the lethality of means. So is the plan that they have lethal? Next, we look at access to the plan. Do they have access to the means that they are considering? And finally, what is their purpose in harming themselves? Are they stating a direct intention to end their life? So it's important to recognize throughout the QPR process that these questions can trigger anxiety and emotions within us, and to get help from a QPR trained responder. Our next step is to persuade. So asking for help from a QPR trained staff member, we then listen first and persuade. We ask the person to get help by listening, validating, normalizing, and grounding ourselves and taking care of ourselves and our own anxiety. So what are we persuading them to do? We persuade them, the R is referring them to various resources. So here you have kind of a list of some resources based on risk level. For example, if they've already taken action, we may actually implement our medical emergency protocol by calling 911 or implementing that protocol. If they have a very specific plan with that is very lethal and we assess a relatively higher risk, we may use a resource like Hall Mercer, which is our local crisis center located at 8th and Locust Street here in Philadelphia. We could also potentially use the mobile crisis unit, and you should talk to a QPR staff member to assess the appropriate need and how to support your client engaging with one of these resources. On the lower end of the risk level, we would always institute a safety plan as well as referral to other services such as mental health services, a primary care physician, or existing supports. And below you have some basic tips on safety planning. We strongly recommend that you don't undertake this whole process yourself, but that you engage a QPR trained staff member to support you, as well as inform your supervisor as a case like this is unfolding. Next, we'll talk briefly about child abuse. Child abuse is defined by the PA Protective Services Act as any recent act in the past 2 years or failure to act by a perpetrator which causes non-accidental serious physical injury, non-accidental serious mental injury, sexual abuse or exploitation, or creating the likelihood of sexual abuse or exploitation, all to a child under the age of 18. You should note that the 2-year statute of limitations for a recent act does not apply to sexual abuse. And child abuse also includes serious neglect or human trafficking, which occurred while the victim was under 18. As you know, over the past several years, child abuse reporting has changed in Pennsylvania, and we feel important you understand what your role is and who should report child abuse. Some NSC staff members are mandated by their professions as mandated reporters. These professional roles include social workers, social service workers, mental health professionals, or interns working alongside staff in these roles. Mandatory reporters should first make a direct report, which we'll talk about in a moment, and then consult with their supervisor. And this is a change that before consulting with your supervisor, you are required by law to make a report first. Any person who has reason to suspect a child is being abused or neglected may report. So if you don't believe yourself to be a mandated reporter, you still may report. And NSC expects that all staff members, interns, and volunteers use sound judgment in determining the appropriate course of action related to child abuse. Please note that our definition of mandated reporter and who should report includes exceptions for attorneys in cases of confidential client communications, work product, and rules of professional conduct. If you're not sure where your status is or if you're a mandated reporter, I encourage you to talk to your supervisor to get clarity. If you choose to report an incident of child abuse, either because you're a mandated reporter or because you're a permissive reporter and you've made a sound judgment call to make a child abuse report, what do? There's really 2 key steps. First, you call Childline to make a report. The Childline worker will ask you key questions like who, what, when, and where. You'll need as much information as possible, but it's also okay if you don't have all the answers to these questions. The report can still be taken. You may need things like the name of children or adults involved, what happened that you believe constitutes abuse or neglect, if you know information about the timing of the incident and whether you expect further imminent harm in any locations. I've included here the child line reporting hotline, which we recommend as the primary mechanism for reporting. Please note that you can also file a report through the online Child Welfare Information Portal, which I've included here. Once you make a report to Childline, you also need to submit a CY-47 form to the department or county agency assigned to the case. This provides additional information, and the CY-47 form you may consult with your supervisor before submitting. But again, with the Childline call, if you're a mandated reporter, you must first make the call and then consult with your supervisor. Some final items to consider here. If you suspect a child is being abused or neglected and you need more information, it's okay to ask and engage with the family about the situation. You also may want to consider making the report in collaboration with your client. This can do a lot to continue to build trust and to ensure transparency within your client relationship. We have had cases where a client has disclosed on behalf of a third party, a roommate or a neighbor, and asked you to make a Childline call. These cases are okay. You can certainly make that call. You also want to ask the disclosing client whether they are willing to have their name and address shared as part of this report, taking into consideration their own confidentiality. If a Childline report is founded and DHS becomes more involved in the case, what is your role as an NSC staff member? We see our role as one of advocate, supporting the client and the family through the process, and you may want to consider connecting with the community umbrella agency, the CUA worker, or other DHS case manager to provide, to ensure language access and to provide support to the case as needed. Next, we'll talk briefly about disclosure of domestic violence. So this protocol should be used for any disclosure of domestic or interpersonal violence or following a domestic violence screening, such as the PSERF. And really, we have two key steps. First, it's really important to listen and validate the client's experience. Sharing phrases like, "Thank you for sharing this with me. I'm glad you told me," and focusing the conversation on what the client is really looking for you from that day. What can I help you with now? What would you like to have happen? It's important for us not to pressure a decision or pass judgment. There may be a wide range of continuum of what the client is seeking from disclosing to you. Based on the client's disclosure, we then assess the situation. We may need to assess if there's imminent danger now by asking questions like, is this still happening now? Or when was the last time this happened? Based on our assessment of danger, we can then provide a wide range of resources. If the client is not in immediate danger, we can provide resources such as the DV hotline, mental health resources, or other referrals, which you can see included on the back of the domestic violence disclosure protocol. We then still want to you still should notify your supervisor in this case. If a client is having a current experience of DV, whether they're in immediate danger or not in immediate danger, we recommend that you engage your supervisor earlier on in the process by using a phrase like, "Thank you for sharing your experience. Is it okay if I get my supervisor who may be able to offer more support?" This provides a resource for you to get more support as you're managing these situations. You can then consider options like calling the DV hotline together or providing the hotline number, referring to other resources like mental health counseling or DV-specific counseling, again indicated on the back page of the protocol. Or in a higher level of need, you may decide with the client to call the hotline or even potentially to call 911. After all these scenarios, it's important to connect with your supervisor and debrief. It's important to recognize that with our domestic violence disclosure protocol, that this debriefing is really important so we can learn and grow from these disclosures and best support our clients moving forward. Finally, on the back, you'll also see a number of guiding principles, which we really feel frame our response in these situations. At NSC, we believe our role when a client discloses domestic violence is to coordinate access to available services. We should educate ourselves on available resources and the dynamics of interpersonal and domestic violence, connect clients to resources, consider our own self-care and engage supports for ourselves, and throughout be mindful of our own assumptions and judgments. We do not want to become the sole provider of information or options, as this is the role of a trained DV provider via the hotline. We do not want to go to the client or family's home or employer or otherwise involve ourselves in the situation as a key player. We're a resource, not the sole lifeline. And we also do not want to make decisions on behalf of the client or the family, but yet empower them to make their own decisions. And finally, we should never underestimate the level of danger, and we should be mindful of the potential dangers within these situations. Finally, we'll touch briefly on our field safety guide. Our field safety guide is one of our more recent protocols created to guide and support you when you're out in the field, and is divided into 3 sections. First, before you go, we recommend that you confirm your client's availability, gather the necessary documentation, including who, what, why, when, and where are you going, and ensure that your direct supervisor knows where you're headed. Ensure transportation fare for yourself from the correct program based on the type of escort and for the client. Send a whereabouts to your team members, including the client ID or initials and the location of the visit, so your direct team knows where you're going. And finally, gather important phone numbers in case of emergency. This should include your supervisor's number and a backup staff person's phone number. We also recommend that your phone is charged so you're not stranded without a way to communicate. Then while you're out, we recommend that you park as close as possible to the home or location, being mindful of your surroundings. In the event of an emergency, please call 911 and follow up with your supervisor. If you feel unsafe at your client's home or in the community, we ask that you avoid walking. You text your supervisor and you use Uber, Lyft, or a taxi to depart or to get to your destination. We also recommend that you share your location with your supervisor using the share location function of Uber, Lyft, or a similar app. If you're working after normal business hours, we ask that you text your supervisor at the beginning and end of the visit. I have left, or I'm home. And finally, in the event of an angry or upset client, we ask that you utilize de-escalation tips to resolve the situation. You'll see later on in this playlist there's a full training on de-escalation as well as a training on the dynamics of interpersonal violence, and we ask that if you have time, you watch those as well. Finally, when you're at the client's home, we ask that you consider scheduling your initial meeting at a neutral location if that's appropriate, if you and your supervisor determine that's appropriate. We ask, if possible, you pick seating that it's a hard surface to help in the prevention of bed bugs. We ask that you avoid bringing personal items in the home, even consider leaving your jacket or bag in your car. It's also best practice to avoid using the restroom in the client's home whenever possible. It may be helpful to map the nearest public restroom that you can utilize. And finally, in the event of a critical incident at the client's home, please follow the appropriate critical incident protocol. Finally, whenever possible, we ask that you avoid accepting food, beverages, rides, or gifts, as our agency policy prohibits accepting compensation from our clients for our work. You can use language like, "Thank you so much for offering, I really appreciate it, but our agency doesn't allow us to accept any gifts. Thank you very much for understanding." Finally, we'll talk about completing an incident report. So any critical incident, a medical emergency, fire, disclosure of domestic violence, child abuse report, should prompt you to complete a critical incident report. For this purpose, we've simplified our critical incident report to the following form, which can also be located on SharePoint under Agency Docs Critical Incident. This form should just take a few minutes for you to complete. It has room for any follow-up action or debriefing that you've done with your colleagues or your supervisor, and then you can turn it into your supervisor and your director, and we'll provide a copy to the Director of Business Operations. If you have further questions on any of these protocols, please consult with your supervisor, and please keep your eyes out for future trainings that will be provided. We provide periodic trainings on more in-depth skills such as QPR for staff and interns to engage in throughout the year. Thank you.